What if the first thing that disappeared was not a city, not a people, not even a coastline, but memory itself? What if history did not begin because nothing came before, but because something ended so completely that even its absence was taught to feel normal? There is a quiet discomfort hidden beneath the timelines we repeat, a sense that the story begins too cleanly, too conveniently, as though the world before a certain moment has been gently erased rather than naturally forgotten. And, before you allow your body to sink fully into this comfort, take just a small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what I am saying makes you want to stay a little longer. If you wish, share where you are and what time it is as you listen. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting together through the night, across cultures that never met, across oceans that once did not exist in their present form. There appears the same pause in the story, a break. A before that is spoken of carefully, symbolically, or not at all. Civilizations emerge already knowing how to farm, how to measure the sky, how to shape stone, how to bury their dead with ritual precision. The question does not arrive loudly, it settles instead, like dust in still air. Where did this knowledge come from, and why does it seem older than the civilizations credited with discovering it? The deeper one listens to the past, the more it resembles an echo rather than a voice. Early texts speak of teachers who arrived after catastrophe, of survivors who carried fragments of something lost, of gods who were less divine than remembered. Geological layers tell a parallel story, one of sudden warming, rising seas, and coastlines swallowed in spans of time too brief for gradual adaptation. Archaeology offers tools that appear abruptly, with no visible lineage, no long apprenticeship carved into the layers beneath them. It is not that history lacks answers. It is that its answers often arrive before the questions are permitted to form. The accepted narrative describes humanity as slow, fragile, experimental. For hundreds of thousands of years we wander. Then, within a narrow window, we settle, organize, calculate, and build. Writing appears, architecture appears, astronomy appears. Not as a hesitant stutter, but as a composed sentence. The gap between ignorance and sophistication feels less like a climb and more like a step. Some suggest coincidence, others suggest inevitability. A smaller number ask whether we are looking at the first rise at all. Flood stories persist not as quaint myths, but as structural memories. They appear with remarkable consistency, describing not only destruction, but moral rupture, a dividing line between ages. Before the waters there was order of a different kind. After, there was rebuilding. What is rarely emphasized is that these stories are not told from the perspective of total extinction. Someone remembers, someone survives, someone carries instructions forward. When stone structures are found aligned to celestial events that require long-term observation, the explanation often leans on intuition or luck. When maps appear, showing coastlines as they would have looked under ice-free conditions, they are treated as anomalies. When ancient sites reveal precision that challenges the assumed limits of their builders, the conversation becomes cautious, restrained, as though curiosity itself must be managed. This is not a rejection of science, it is an observation about its comfort zones. The world before the flood, whatever form that phrase may represent, sits outside the timelines we prefer. It suggests continuity where we are taught rupture. It implies inheritance where we insist on invention. It raises the unsettling possibility that progress is not linear, but cyclical, rising and falling like the seas that have repeatedly redrawn the edges of the continents. If a civilization existed before the last great inundation, it would not need to resemble ours in every detail. Advancement does not require sameness. Knowledge can specialize. Technology can follow paths that leave little trace after collapse. Organic materials vanish. Coastlines sink. Memory erodes faster than stone. What remains is pattern. The oldest monumental sites often appear where water once dominated. River deltas, coastal plains, now submerged shelves. Places most vulnerable to rising seas are precisely where early complexity would have flourished, and precisely where evidence would be most difficult to recover. Absence, in this context, becomes ambiguous. Is it proof of non-existence, or evidence of loss? There is a quiet tension between what is known and what is permitted to be considered. Academic caution is necessary, but it can also become a gate. Not all questions are rewarded equally. Some are gently redirected. Others are left unfunded, unpublished, or framed as distractions. This is not always conspiracy. Often, it is inertia. Systems prefer stability. Narratives prefer closure. Yet the unease persists. If humanity has risen more than once, then we're not exceptional. We're recurrent. If knowledge can be lost, then progress is not guaranteed. If the past holds forgotten sophistication, then the future may hold the same vulnerability. These thoughts do not announce themselves, they whisper. They wait until the noise fades. The world before the flood does not demand belief. It asks for attention. It invites the listener to notice the spaces between dates, the silences between layers, the moments where explanation feels rehearsed rather than discovered. It does not insist that history is false. It suggests that it may be incomplete. And if that is true, then the question is not what existed before the waters rose, but why we are so certain it could not have been more than we are told. The silence before memory is not empty. It is patient, and it has been waiting longer than we have been listening. If the flood stories were merely metaphors, they would have faded with the cultures that told them. Instead, they persist with an unusual density of detail, repeating themselves across distances that should have diluted their coherence. Long before writing bound memory to clay or parchment, these accounts travelled by voice, by ritual, by symbol, retaining their central structure even as names and setting shifted. Water rises, the world ends, a few endure, something essential is carried forward. This persistence creates an uncomfortable tension. Myths are expected to diverge wildly when separated by geography and time, yet flood narratives from Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica and the Pacific echo one another with an insistence that resists dismissal. They describe not only destruction, but a world before destruction, one marked by order, hierarchy and knowledge that does not need to be invented anew after the waters recede. The survivors do not grope blindly. They rebuild with intent. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is not an accident. It is a response to imbalance, to a humanity that has grown loud, numerous, or perhaps too capable. The gods regret their decision only after witnessing the scale of erasure. What lingers is not divine wrath, but remorse, as though something valuable was lost alongside the excess. Similar emotions surface in other traditions. Regret follows the deluge. Silence follows regret. In the Hebrew tradition, the flood resets the moral order, but Noah is not an ignorant man. He understands construction, logistics, preservation. He is instructed, but he is also competent. In Mesoamerican accounts, earlier worlds are destroyed not once but repeatedly, each age ending when balance fails. In Hindu cosmology, cycles of creation and dissolution stretch far beyond human time, rendering collapse not exceptional, but expected. These stories do not speak in the language of geology, yet they align uneasily with it. Around 12,000 years ago, the planet underwent a dramatic transition. Ice sheets retreated, sea levels rose rapidly, entire landscapes vanished beneath water. What had been habitable for thousands of years became inaccessible within generations. The end of the Younger Dryas marked not just a climatic shift, but a psychological one. The world became unstable in ways that memory would struggle to contain. If people lived along coastlines now submerged, and evidence suggests they did, then the flood would not have been a single event, but a relentless encroachment. Villages lost, roots erased, sacred sites drowned. Knowledge tied to place would dissolve as surely as the land itself. Survival would favour those who could adapt quickly, who could move inland, who could compress memory into portable forms, stories, symbols, rituals. Myths, in this sense, are not fantasies. They are compression algorithms. The question is not whether the floods happened. The geological record answers that. The deeper question is what existed before them that required remembering. Flood stories often describe a prior age as longer lived, more stable, sometimes even morally distinct. People lived closer to the gods, or were themselves closer to something lost. The boundary between human and divine blurs in these accounts, suggesting not literal immortality, but proximity to a source of knowledge now obscured. Skeptics argue that floods are universal because water is universally feared. Rivers overflow, storms destroy. Yet this explanation struggles with specificity. Many flood myths include precise details: the timing of rains, the preservation of species, the survival of specialized knowledge. These are not the hallmarks of abstract fear. They resemble recollection shaped by symbolism rather than imagination. It is notable that these stories often emerge fully formed in the earliest texts of a culture, rather than evolving slowly. They arrive already ancient, already settled, as though inherited rather than composed. In Mesopotamia, the flood narrative predates the writing system that records it. The story is older than the medium that preserves it. This inversion hints at a depth of time that resists tidy chronology. What is also absent from many of these myths is triumph. The flood is not celebrated, it is endured. Survivors do not boast of conquest. They mourn what cannot be restored. This emotional tone is consistent across cultures. Loss, not victory, defines the transition. Such uniformity suggests a shared experience refracted through local language, not independent invention. If a technologically advanced civilization existed before the flood, it would not need to resemble ours in machinery or materials. Advancement can manifest as environmental mastery, long-term planning, precise observation of natural cycles. These forms of sophistication leave fewer artifacts, especially when their centers are drowned. Stone survives, metal corrodes, organic systems vanish almost entirely. The absence of direct evidence becomes a paradox. We demand proof from places most likely to have been erased. We search dry land for coastal civilizations. We excavate deserts for memories buried under oceans. When nothing is found, we take comfort in the silence, mistaking it for certainty. Yet the flood myths continue to speak. They do not claim perfection for the world before. They do not insist on utopia. They imply complexity, order that could fail, knowledge that could be misused, structures, social, moral or technological, that grew brittle under their own weight. This is not a child's fantasy of a golden age. It is a sober reflection on fragility. What troubles modern frameworks is not the idea of catastrophe, but the idea of inheritance. If knowledge survived the flood, then some of what we consider original may be remembered. Some of what we call invention may be reconstruction. This challenges the narrative of steady ascent. It introduces humility into a story that prefers confidence. The flood, then, is not merely an ending, it is a filter. It determines what kinds of knowledge endure and which vanish. It favours adaptability over accumulation. It selects for memory rather than monument. And if that is true, then the most important remnants of the pre-flood world may not be buried in stone at all, but embedded in the stories we were taught to outgrow, stories that never claim to be literal, yet never ask to be forgotten. As the waters recede in these accounts, the world feels smaller, less certain. The sky remains, but its meanings have shifted. People look upward not with mastery, but with caution. Something has changed, and not everything that was lost can be named. The flood myths refuse to die because they are not finished speaking. They linger at the edge of accepted history, waiting for a listener willing to treat them not as answers, but as signals, pointing toward a past that may have been more complex and more advanced than we have allowed ourselves to imagine. The difficulty does not begin with myth. It begins with stone, with layers of earth that do not behave as neatly as timelines prefer, with bones that appear where they should not, and tools that arrive without ancestry. The further back one looks, the more the ground itself seems to hesitate, as though uncertain which story it is meant to tell. There are places where human presence appears suddenly, without the slow rehearsal expected of gradual development. Sites where architecture seems to leap forward, skipping entire chapters of experimentation. The stone does not show indecision. It does not record failure. It stands already knowing what it is meant to become. This absence of trial has been explained many ways: lost evidence, erosion, coincidence. But the pattern persists too often to feel accidental. In the deep past, time does not flow evenly. It compresses, it fractures, it leaves gaps that are not empty but crowded with uncertainty. The archaeological record is often treated as a continuous narrative, interrupted by occasional damage. Yet in some regions, continuity itself is the interruption. Long stretches pass with little trace, followed by abrupt fluorescence. Something changes, something arrives. Human bones tell a similarly uneasy story. Anatomically, modern humans appear tens of thousands of years before the behaviours that supposedly define them. The mind seems to awaken late, as though waiting for a trigger that is never clearly identified. Symbolic art, complex tools, long-distance trade, all emerge within a narrow window, clustered tightly in time. The leap feels disproportionate to the span that precedes it. One explanation suggests cognitive mutation, another points to population density. Both offer partial comfort. Neither explains the quiet sophistication embedded in early practices, burial rituals that imply cosmology, toolkits that suggest planning beyond immediate need, seasonal knowledge that requires long-term observation passed across generations. Stone circles and megalithic sites amplify this tension. Their alignment with solstices and equinoxes implies careful tracking of celestial cycles. Such tracking requires patience, continuity, and a stable tradition of observation. It is not knowledge gained quickly. It is knowledge inherited or preserved. When these structures appear at the dawn of recorded culture, they arrive already informed by a sky that has been watched for centuries. The problem is not that these people were incapable. It is that they appear capable too soon. Geology complicates matters further. The last ice age did not end gently. Meltwater pulses raise sea levels by meters within human lifetimes. Entire coastal plains vanished beneath advancing oceans. These were not remote hinterlands, but fertile zones where complexity would naturally gather. If cities existed there, built of wood, earth, or softer stone, they would leave little behind. The sea is thorough in its forgetting. What remains inland may represent not the origin of civilization, but its retreat. This possibility reframes the gaps in the record. The absence of transitional forms becomes less mysterious if earlier forms are underwater. The lack of gradual build-up becomes less troubling if the build-up occurred elsewhere. What appears as sudden emergence may be the visible remainder of a much longer submerged process. There are artifacts that trouble conventional sequencing, tools whose craftsmanship exceeds what their context predicts. Stone vases carved with precision that challenges even modern replication. Cuts that suggest techniques not easily reconciled with simple hand tools. These objects are often isolated, treated as curiosities rather than signals. They are explained individually rather than collectively. Yet patterns emerge when they are allowed to speak to one another. The official story requires that complexity be slow, linear, and irreversible. Once knowledge is gained, it is assumed to remain. Loss is treated as rare, localized, or superficial. But history itself contradicts this. Libraries burn, skills vanish. Entire technologies become myths within a few generations. The collapse of a system can erase centuries of refinement faster than they were accumulated. If such loss can occur in documented history, it can occur even more thoroughly in prehistory. The idea of a pre-flood advanced world does not require perfection or global uniformity. It requires only that some regions reached levels of organization and understanding beyond what survives in the record. It requires that catastrophe disrupted continuity so completely that later societies inherited fragments without context. Those fragments would appear anomalous. They would feel out of place. They would invite explanations that preserve the larger narrative rather than disrupt it. Consider how often anomalies are explained away through isolation. A single site is labelled unique. A single artifact is dismissed as ceremonial. A single alignment is called coincidence. But anomalies multiply. They cluster. They begin to outline a silhouette that is never directly acknowledged. The stone remembers differently than text. It does not argue, it endures, but it also erodes, fractures, sinks. Time is not its ally. When the stone record is incomplete, interpretation fills the void. An interpretation, like memory, is shaped by expectation. There is a quiet assumption that early humans could not have known what we know because they lacked our tools. But tools follow knowledge, not the other way around. Observation precedes instrumentation. Counting precedes calculation. Awareness of cycles precedes clocks. One can know much without leaving much behind. The gaps in stone and bone do not accuse, they suggest. They ask whether absence is being mistaken for simplicity. They hint that what we see as beginnings may be survivals. If the world before the flood hosted societies that understood their environment deeply, its seasons, its skies, its thresholds, then their loss would leave precisely the kind of record we find. Abrupt sophistication, followed by long silence, memory without method, pattern without origin. These gaps do not demand belief. They demand patience. They ask the listener to remain with uncertainty rather than rush toward closure. They invite the possibility that the past is not hiding, but waiting, just beyond the edge of what we have been willing to ask. And if time itself is fragmented by catastrophe, then the question is not why the record is broken, but why we expect it to be whole. There is a moment in every civilization when knowledge seems to appear already formed, as if it had been waiting for hands capable of holding it. Mathematics does not stumble into existence. Astronomy does not begin with guessing. Agriculture does not emerge from chaos without a memory of seasons already observed. Yet the record repeatedly shows these systems arriving together, clustered tightly in time, with little evidence of the long hesitation we would expect. This creates a quiet problem. Knowledge is cumulative, but its visible accumulation is often missing. In the earliest urban societies, counting systems are already abstract. Calendars already track celestial cycles with precision. Architecture already obeys proportions that imply mathematical awareness rather than accidental symmetry. Writing, when it arrives, does not begin as crude notation. It begins as administration, law, ritual, and cosmology intertwined. The leap feels less like invention and more like recall. One explanation offered is rapid cultural acceleration. Under the right pressures, it is said, humans innovate quickly. Yet this explanation rests on a fragile assumption, that innovation begins from zero. In practice, acceleration requires a foundation. Sudden knowledge still needs prior observation. Systems do not emerge fully coherent unless fragments already exist. The problem becomes clearer when considering astronomy. Tracking solstices, equinoxes, and longer celestial cycles demands patience across generations. No single observer can verify a full precessional cycle. Even shorter lunar patterns require sustained attention and careful recording. When ancient cultures demonstrate this awareness early in their timelines, the implication is not genius, it is inheritance. The same tension appears in metallurgy. Smelting requires controlled heat, specific materials, and experiential refinement. The jump from native copper to alloyed bronze is not trivial. It implies experimentation, failure, and adjustment. Yet in many regions, bronze appears with little visible developmental scaffolding. The ladder exists, but many rungs are missing. Knowledge does not like to leave footprints. It migrates easily. It survives collapse better than infrastructure. A single teacher can carry more complexity than a city. A small group can preserve techniques long after the context that produced them has vanished. This makes knowledge difficult to date. Its presence does not guarantee its origin. In flood myths, survivors are often described as bearers of instruction. They teach agriculture, law, and ritual to those who come after. These figures are later mythologized, elevated into culture heroes or gods. The symbolic language obscures a practical function: transmission. After catastrophe, memory becomes sacred. The discomfort arises when these myths align too well with material evidence. When early societies display competence disproportionate to their apparent age, the mythic explanation begins to feel less fantastical and more functional. It suggests that what is remembered as divine intervention may be cultural inheritance reframed through reverence. Modern frameworks resist this idea because it destabilizes authorship. If knowledge is inherited, then the first civilizations were not creators but custodians. Their brilliance lies not in invention, but in preservation and adaptation. This is a quieter form of achievement, less dramatic, less compatible with narratives of heroic beginnings. There is also the question of loss. Knowledge can be selective. Not everything survives. Techniques dependent on environment vanish when that environment disappears. Skills tied to specific materials become useless when those materials are inaccessible. What remains may be abstracted: numbers, symbols, alignments, divorced from the systems that once supported them. This could explain why ancient knowledge sometimes feels strangely incomplete. Astronomy without astrophysics, geometry without algebra, precision without theory. The scaffolding has collapsed, leaving only the upper floors visible. We see the outcomes and not the processes. The world before the flood, if it hosted advanced systems of understanding, may have favoured harmony over expansion. Its technologies may have been subtle, optimised for stability rather than scale. Such systems leave fewer ruins. They are efficient, not monumental. When destroyed, they leave little trace. It is also possible that some knowledge was intentionally simplified after catastrophe. In unstable conditions, complexity becomes a liability. Teaching must be rapid. Systems must be robust. Nuance is sacrificed for survival. What is passed down is what can be remembered easily, what can be applied immediately. This creates an illusion of simplicity in the past. We see early societies using basic tools and assume basic minds. But tools reflect context, not capacity. A person can understand celestial mechanics while using stone implements. Awareness does not require machinery. The suddenness of ancient knowledge is therefore not evidence of impossibility but of compression. Time collapses under pressure. Learning is accelerated by necessity. Memory is sharpened by loss. What unsettles the modern listener is not that ancient people were capable, but that they may have known more than they appeared to, more than we are comfortable granting them, more than fits neatly into a story of linear ascent. If the flood marked a rupture in continuity, then the knowledge that surfaces afterward would feel out of place, too old for its context, too refined for its setting. It would demand explanation without offering origin, and so it is explained away, as coincidence, as genius, as independent invention repeated across cultures by chance. Yet repetition itself suggests structure. The problem of sudden knowledge is not a challenge to science. It is a challenge to storytelling. It asks whether we have mistaken recovery for discovery, whether we have confused remembrance with creation, whether the past we see is not the first chapter, but the second, written by those who survived long enough to speak. If that is the case, then the true beginning lies somewhere beneath water, beneath sediment, beneath stories that no longer remember how they learned what they know. And the question remains unresolved, hovering between layers of stone and silence. How much of what we call progress is simply the echo of something already lost? Some of the most unsettling objects from the past are not buried in earth, but drawn on parchment. They do not erode. They argue. They present information with a calm confidence that feels out of place, as though the world they describe does not match the one their creators are supposed to have known. Maps, in particular, have a way of revealing what people notice long before they are expected to notice it. There exist early cartographic works that depict coastlines with a precision difficult to reconcile with their stated age. Shorelines appear not as they exist today, but as they would have existed under very different climatic conditions: ice-free contours, extended land bridges, river systems now submerged. These are not imaginative flourishes. They are geographically coherent. They obey rules of proportion and scale. The explanation often offered is synthesis. Ancient map makers, it is said, gathered fragments from many travellers and combined them. Knowledge accreted slowly, imperfectly, until an approximate image emerged. Yet some of these maps show accuracy in regions that would have been inaccessible, even conceptually, to their supposed sources. Polar lands appear without ice. Southern continents are rendered with detail that would require either direct observation or inherited memory. The discomfort does not arise from the existence of maps, but from what they imply about perspective. To map a coastline accurately, one must either traverse it extensively or possess a reference beyond local experience. One must know not only where one is, but where one is not. This suggests a level of spatial abstraction that is not easily improvised. When questioned, the maps do not explain themselves. They simply exist, copied, recopied, annotated, corrected. Their origins fade while their outlines persist. Later generations treat them as curiosities or mistakes, unaware that they may be looking at echoes rather than errors. The sea level rise following the last ice age reshaped the planet dramatically. Vast areas now underwater were once exposed and habitable. If earlier cultures mapped these regions, their maps would immediately appear anachronistic to later observers. Coastlines would no longer match reality. Land would seem to vanish. What was once accurate would become suspect. This creates a strange inversion. The older the map, the more wrong it appears, unless one knows how to read it against a deeper timeline. Cartography does not require satellites. It requires patience, movement, and continuity. A culture that navigates extensively, that values orientation, that tracks stars and currents, can produce accurate representations of space without advanced machinery. Such knowledge would be precious, portable, and easily copied. Precisely the kind of knowledge that might survive catastrophe even when cities do not. There is also the matter of projection. Some ancient maps seem to use mathematical principles that were not formally described until much later. They account for curvature. They preserve relative distances. They imply an understanding of Earth not merely as terrain, but as form. This understanding does not emerge spontaneously. It accumulates. It is taught. It assumes prior conversation. The pre-flood world, if it existed as a network of coastal cultures, would have had strong incentives to understand geography deeply. Trade, migration, seasonal movement, all demand orientation. A stable climate over long periods would allow for refinement. Catastrophe would interrupt this process, scattering both people and their charts. What remains afterward would look like fragments of an impossible whole. Skepticism is reasonable. Extraordinary claims demand restraint. But restraint should not harden into refusal. When multiple maps from different times and places point towards similar anomalies, curiosity becomes responsibility. The question is not whether the maps are perfect, but why they consistently challenge the limits we assign to their creators. Maps are memory made visible. They externalize knowledge so that it can outlast individuals. In times of stability, they evolve slowly. In times of collapse, they become relics, copied without comprehension, preserved without context. Later civilizations inherit these relics and reinterpret them through their own assumptions. Errors are introduced, corrections are layered. Yet beneath the palimpsest, the original contours persist, stubborn and unsettling. There is a temptation to treat these maps as coincidences, or to attribute their accuracy to chance alignment with modern expectations. But chance does not produce consistency across independent sources, nor does imagination conform so neatly to geophysical reality. The maps do not claim that the world before the flood was technologically identical to ours. They suggest something more subtle, that it was observed carefully, understood patiently, and remembered imperfectly, that its knowledge travelled forward through disruption, changing shape as it moved. If coastlines once mapped are now drowned, then the civilizations that mapped them likely were as well. Their absence is not proof of non-existence. It is a consequence of geography. Water erases more efficiently than time. The discomfort we feel when confronting these maps is not fear of error, but fear of implication. If earlier cultures possessed accurate global knowledge, then our sense of uniqueness softens. We become part of a longer pattern of rise, observation, loss, and rediscovery. Maps remind us that the past was not blind. It looked outward. It measured. It remembered. And when the world changed, it carried those measurements forward in lines and curves that would one day be questioned by those who forgot how much had already been seen. The question left hanging is not whether these maps are genuine, but what kind of world produces knowledge that outlives its makers? What kind of catastrophe forces memory to flatten itself into symbols? And how much of our own understanding would survive if coastline shifted again? If familiar reference points disappeared beneath rising water? In the quiet persistence of these maps lies a challenge. Not to rewrite history, but to widen it. To allow for the possibility that some knowledge arrives from behind us, not ahead. And if the world before the flood once knew the shape of the earth more intimately than we assume, then perhaps the true mystery is not how they learned it, but how easily we forgot. There are structures that do not behave like ruins. They resist explanation not because they are damaged, but because they are intact in ways that feel deliberate. Their stones fit too closely. Their angles repeat too precisely. Their weight seems misjudged, either underestimated by those who describe them, or overestimated by those who try to explain them away. Engineering usually leaves a trail. Scaffolding marks, incremental refinement, failed attempts abandoned nearby. Yet some of the oldest monumental sites appear without these signs. The methods that shape them do not linger in the debris. The learning curve is absent. What remains is the result, not the process. This absence is often interpreted as loss, techniques forgotten, tools decomposed, knowledge eroded by time. These explanations are plausible, yet incomplete. Loss explains disappearance, but not competence. It accounts for silence, but not fluency. Stone weighing dozens of tons was moved, lifted, and placed with intent. Not dragged crudely, but positioned as though weight were a parameter, not an obstacle. Surfaces were leveled to tolerances that challenge even modern machinery. Cuts appear where impact tools would be inefficient, suggesting abrasion, vibration, or techniques that leave no obvious signature. The question is not how this was done, but why it was done this way. Many of these structures are not purely functional. They do not maximize interior space. They do not optimize shelter. They orient themselves instead toward horizons, stars, and cycles that outlast human lifespans. Their purpose feels temporal rather than immediate, as though they were designed to persist through change rather than dominate it. Engineering without a timeline feels unsettling because it breaks expectation. We want progress to be visible. We want technology to announce itself. When it does not, we assume absence. But subtlety can be a feature. Efficiency can appear primitive when stripped of context. A pre-flood civilization might have engineered for durability rather than expansion, for alignment rather than accumulation, for resonance rather than spectacle. Such priorities would leave behind monuments that seem ceremonial but function as anchors, marking time, place, and memory across disruption. After catastrophe, later societies encounter these structures without instructions. They inherit the stones but not the reasons, meaning shifts. What was once technical becomes sacred. What was once measurement becomes myth. The structure remains, but its language changes. This transformation complicates interpretation. When engineering becomes ritualized, its original function is obscured. We see intention, but not implementation. We sense purpose, but not method. The result feels mysterious because we are missing the vocabulary that once made it ordinary. Modern reconstructions often rely on brute force explanations. Thousands of labourers, decades of effort. These models satisfy scale but ignore precision. They assume strength where coordination is more efficient. They emphasize muscle over planning. Yet engineering is rarely about force alone. It is about constraints, about understanding material behavior, about anticipating failure. These skills do not require industrial technology. They require observation, patience, and repetition. If such knowledge existed before the flood, it may have been distributed unevenly. Centres of expertise along coasts now submerged, inland sites preserved not as hubs, but as markers. What survives may represent the periphery of a much larger system. The idea that engineering knowledge could be lost feels uncomfortable, because it challenges permanence. We like to believe that once something is known, it cannot be unknown, but history suggests otherwise. Skills disappear when they are no longer needed. Knowledge atrophies without application. Complexity collapses faster than it accumulates. There is also the possibility of intentional restraint. A civilization that understands its environment deeply may choose not to exploit it fully. Expansion is not the only measure of advancement. Stability, sustainability, and balance can be goals in themselves. If the pre-flood world valued these qualities, its engineering would reflect them. Minimal footprint, long-term alignment, structures that interact with landscape rather than dominate it. Such engineering would leave fewer traces, especially after inundation. What remains inland might therefore feel incomplete. Isolated achievements without visible infrastructure, mastery without apparent industry. These are not contradictions. They are artifacts of selective survival. The difficulty lies in interpretation. We approach these sites with assumptions shaped by our own priorities. We look for quarries, ramps, debris. When we do not find them, we invent them. We project our methods backward rather than asking what methods were actually necessary. Engineering without a timeline forces humility. It suggests that capability does not always announce its arrival, that sophistication can exist quietly, that loss can erase explanation while leaving accomplishment intact. If the world before the flood engineered with knowledge we no longer possess, then these structures are not puzzles to be solved, but messages to be acknowledged. They say that something was once known well enough to be trusted with stone. That knowledge survived long enough to be built into the land itself. And when the waters rose, that knowledge did not vanish entirely. It hardened, it waited, it allowed later generations to walk among its remnants and wonder. The question is not whether ancient people could have done these things. The stones answer that. The question is whether we are prepared to consider that the timeline we rely on may be missing an entire chapter, one in which engineering did not begin but continued quietly, until the world changed too quickly for it to adapt. And if that chapter lies beneath water, beneath sediment, beneath the assumption that advancement must always move forward, then the silence around these structures is not ignorance. It is a pause, holding space for something that has not yet been fully remembered. Language is supposed to grow slowly. Sounds shift. Meanings drift. Grammar accumulates irregularities like sediment. Yet some of the oldest known languages appear already complex, already structured, already burdened with exceptions that suggest a long, invisible past. There is no linguistic equivalent of a first word, no moment where language begins in simplicity and gradually becomes expressive. Instead, when writing systems emerge, they do so in fully formed environments of speech. Grammar is already layered, vocabulary already abstract, metaphor already embedded. Language arrives not as invention, but as inheritance. This creates a quiet contradiction. If early societies were just beginning to organize, why do their languages already carry the weight of long use? Why do they encode concepts that require sustained cultural continuity, law, time, obligation, cosmology, rather than immediate survival? Some ancient languages appear to have no clear ancestors. They do not evolve cleanly from earlier forms that can be traced step by step. Instead, they enter the record abruptly, surrounded by silence. Later languages descend from them, fragment from them, simplify or complicate them, but their own origins remain obscured. Linguists explain this through loss. Earlier stages existed but were not recorded. Speech predates writing, after all. This is true but incomplete. Speech does not preserve complexity indefinitely without reinforcement. Languages simplify when isolated. They fracture when populations scatter. Sustained grammatical depth requires continuity. Catastrophe disrupts this continuity. Flood, migration, collapse. These events should fragment language severely. Yet after such disruptions, we often find languages that appear resilient, structured, and capable of transmitting complex instruction. This resilience suggests intentional preservation. In myth, survivors often carry words as carefully as tools. Names matter, pronunciation matters. Certain phrases are repeated unchanged across generations, treated as sacred. This is not poetic embellishment. It is linguistic conservation. In times of loss, language becomes an archive. The written word intensifies this effect. When writing appears, it does not begin with storytelling. It begins with accounting, astronomy, law, and ritual. These are not beginner uses. They require precision. They assume shared meaning. Writing does not teach language, it freezes it. This freezing reveals depth. Early texts already reference concepts they do not explain. They assume familiarity with systems older than themselves. The reader is expected to know what is meant. This expectation implies an audience already immersed in a linguistic tradition. The flood, if it shattered earlier societies, would have compressed language rather than erased it. Survivors would simplify vocabulary, prioritize clarity, encode essential knowledge into repeatable forms. Poetry, chant, and ritual would serve as containers. Over time, these containers would harden into grammar. What emerges afterward would feel ancient even at birth. There is also the question of universality. Certain symbolic patterns recur across unrelated languages. Concepts of cycle, balance, ascent, descent. Spatial metaphors tied to morality. Temporal metaphors tied to agriculture and astronomy. These are not arbitrary. They reflect shared ways of understanding the world. If these patterns arose independently everywhere, coincidence stretches thin. If they were inherited from a shared source, they make sense. A pre-flood linguistic substrate, diverse in expression, unified in structure, could seed later languages with common frameworks even as vocabulary diverged. This does not require a single global tongue. It requires shared conceptual scaffolding. ways of thinking that survive translation, ideas that persist even when words change. Language carries memory differently than stone. It is adaptive. It reshapes itself to fit new environments, but it also resists total reinvention. Core structures persist stubbornly. They outlive empires. They cross oceans unnoticed. If the world before the flood cultivated complex systems of knowledge, its language would reflect that. Precision in observation demands precision in speech. Instruction requires nuance. Planning across generations requires grammar capable of conditional thought, abstraction, and recursion. After catastrophe, these features would not vanish immediately. They would degrade slowly, unevenly. Some languages would retain depth, others would simplify. What we see in the record may represent a spectrum of survival rather than a point of origin. This perspective reframes linguistic history. Instead of seeing complexity as something achieved late, we might see it as something preserved unevenly. Instead of viewing early languages as primitive beginnings, we might see them as compressed remnants of something broader. The discomfort lies in implication. If language itself bears signs of prior advancement, then cognition did not evolve in isolation. It was shaped by cultures already capable of abstract thought long before writing recorded it. The mind did not awaken suddenly. It remembered. This does not diminish human creativity. It deepens it. It suggests that imagination has long been coupled with stewardship, that language was not merely a tool for expression, but a vessel for survival. The languages that reach us from antiquity speak in voices already old. They whisper of systems they assume rather than explain. They carry metaphors that feel inherited rather than invented. They point backward even as they move forward. If the flood fractured civilization, language may be one of the few bridges that survived intact, not whole, not pure, but functional enough to transmit fragments of a deeper past. And so the question lingers beneath every ancient word. Are we listening to the beginning of speech, or to its echo? The sky has always been a mirror that remembers longer than we do. Long before instruments refined sight, the heavens offered patterns that rewarded patience. Stars rise and fall with an indifference that teaches discipline. Planets wander against fixed constellations, tracing loops that only make sense when watched over years. To notice these things is simple. To understand them requires continuity. What unsettles is not that ancient people looked up, but that they appear to have looked long enough. In early cultures, celestial knowledge arrives already arranged. Calendars align with solstices. Rituals coincide with eclipses. Architecture marks equinoxes with shadows that behave as though rehearsed. These systems do not function on intuition alone. They depend on records, mental, oral, or symbolic, carried forward through generations. The sky must be trusted to repeat itself. The observer must be trusted to remember. Precession complicates this trust. The slow wobble of Earth's axis shifts the background of the stars over thousands of years. To detect it requires comparison across centuries. No single lifetime suffices. Awareness of such motion implies inheritance, not discovery. It suggests that observations were preserved long enough to be compared with new ones, and that discrepancies were noticed rather than ignored. When ancient monuments encode celestial alignments that only make sense across deep time, they imply not merely observation, but intention. The builders anticipated a future viewer who would see what they saw differently. This is a subtle form of engineering, temporal rather than mechanical. It builds not to dominate space, but to converse with time. Astronomy before telescopes is often framed as guesswork refined by myth. Yet myths themselves behave like data sets, storing relationships between sky and season in narrative form. Stories of dying and rising gods track solar cycles. Serpents and birds encode stellar paths. What appears poetic may be practical, designed to survive disruption by embedding measurement and meaning. If the world before the flood possessed advanced astronomical knowledge, It would likely prioritize portability. Charts carved in stone are heavy. Stories travel lightly. A chant can cross oceans. A symbol can be remembered after maps are lost. Catastrophe favours the small and the repeatable. The post-flood world inherits these fragments and treats them as sacred. Accuracy becomes authority. The sky is no longer merely observed, it is obeyed. This shift marks a change in relationship. What was once understood becomes venerated. Knowledge hardens into doctrine. This hardening can obscure origin. When rules are preserved without explanation, they appear timeless. Calendars feel inevitable. Alignments feel destined. The work that created them disappears behind reverence. Later generations assume that the sky has always been known this way. The difficulty arises when astronomical precision appears where it should not. When early societies track lunar cycles with minimal error. When they predict eclipses without written tables. When they align structures to celestial events that require careful surveying and patience. These achievements are often isolated as marvels, not integrated as evidence of continuity. But continuity is the simplest explanation. A stable climate allows long observation. A connected culture allows comparison across regions. A shared language of the sky allows accumulation. If such conditions existed before the flood, then the astronomical sophistication that appears afterward is not surprising. It is residual. The flood disrupts observation by erasing horizons. Coastlines shift. Reference points vanish. The sky remains, but the ground beneath it changes. Observatories drown. Line of sight alignments break. Knowledge becomes abstracted from place. The observer adapts by generalizing. This adaptation leaves traces. Astronomy becomes symbolic. Measurement yields to myth. Yet precision lingers, disguised as ritual exactness. Dates must be honoured. Directions must be correct. The system survives by changing its clothing. Modern reconstructions often underestimate the power of naked-eye astronomy. With dark skies and disciplined practice, subtle motions become apparent. Patterns emerge. Repetition teaches expectation. The sky reveals itself to those who wait. What is required is not technology, but time. If the pre-flood world valued astronomical understanding, it would integrate it into daily life. Agriculture, navigation, ceremony, all would synchronize with the heavens. Such integration would make astronomical literacy common, not elite. After catastrophe, this literacy would fragment. Specialists would remain. General understanding would thin. The remnants we see may therefore reflect specialization rather than ubiquity. What appears extraordinary may have once been ordinary. There is also the matter of intent. Astronomy can be predictive or commemorative. It can be used to anticipate change or to remember it. Alignments that mark solstices can also mark anniversaries. Structures that track stars can also encode history. The sky becomes a ledger. If the flood marked a rupture, then astronomical markers might serve as anchors, ways to locate oneself after displacement, to know when to plant, when to travel, when to gather. The sky becomes the only stable reference in a world that has lost its landmarks. This reliance intensifies respect. Over time, respect becomes myth. Myth becomes law. Law becomes identity. The original function recedes, leaving a reverent shell. What troubles modern interpretation is the assumption that ancient astronomy must be primitive because it lacks instruments. But instruments are extensions, not origins. The origin is attention, the willingness to look night after night and notice what changes. If attention was abundant before the flood, then the knowledge that followed would feel abrupt only because its roots were submerged. The sky does not forget. It repeats patiently. It allows comparison across ages. It invites memory to stretch beyond individual lives. When ancient cultures demonstrate astronomical coherence early in their histories, the implication is not miracle. it is duration. And if duration was broken by catastrophe, then the knowledge that surfaces afterward carries the quiet gravity of something older than its context. The sky we see is the same sky they saw. The difference is not position, but patience. The question that remains is not how ancient people knew so much, but how long they had been watching before the world changed. What vanishes most completely is rarely what collapses first. Empires fall loudly, but cultures fade quietly, dissolving into habits that no longer remember their origin. A global culture, if it existed before the flood, would not leave behind a single ruin or a unified script. It would fragment, shedding coherence as it moved through disruption, leaving behind patterns rather than monuments. Uniformity is not required for connection. Trade creates similarity without sameness. Shared observation produces alignment without control. A world linked by coastlines and currents would exchange ideas long before it exchanged flags. Knowledge would move faster than authority. Techniques would spread without allegiance. After catastrophe, this network would unravel, not into chaos, but into isolation. What we call the rise of civilizations may instead be the slow reappearance of nodes in a once-connected system, isolated pockets rebuilding from shared memory. Local traditions carrying hints of a broader conversation now silenced. Similar symbols appearing across continents, not because they were invented repeatedly, but because they were once exchanged freely. The disappearance of a global culture does not announce itself with destruction alone. It announces itself with redundancy. When many cultures tell similar stories without knowing one another, when they measure time in comparable ways, when they orient sacred space toward the same sky. These echoes suggest separation from a common source rather than independent origin. Skepticism often points to diffusion as implausible in deep prehistory. Distance is too great, means too limited. Yet the sea is not a barrier, it is a corridor. For much of human history, water connected more efficiently than land. Coasts were highways. Currents were guides. Islands were stations, not endpoints. If sea levels were lower before the flood, these corridors would have been broader and more forgiving. Travel would have been easier, exchange more frequent, cultural coherence more achievable. When the waters rose, these routes drowned. Connections severed. What remained were inland fragments, each convinced of its own uniqueness. The archaeological record reflects this fragmentation. Similarities appear where continuity is not expected. Stone techniques repeat across regions. Symbolic motifs recur. Architectural choices rhyme. Yet no single origin is acknowledged. The connections are treated as coincidence, or explained through limited contact rather than shared inheritance. This reluctance stems from scale. A global culture implies coordination beyond what is assumed possible, but coordination does not require central control. It requires shared constraints and mutual benefit. Climate stability, abundant resources, predictable seasons. Under such conditions, cooperation emerges naturally. The flood disrupts these conditions. Stability becomes uncertainty. Abundance becomes scarcity. Cooperation narrows to survival. Long-distance exchange becomes risk. Knowledge that once flowed freely becomes guarded, localized, sacred. Over time, divergence accelerates. Shared symbols drift in meaning. Techniques adapt to new environments. Memory becomes myth. What was once practical is reinterpreted as divine. The common thread thins but does not break. This process leaves behind a peculiar signature, similarity without explanation. Parallel developments that feel too aligned to be random, yet too dispersed to be coordinated by later contact. The signature of a culture that existed long enough to spread but not long enough to endure. The idea of a vanished global culture challenges modern identity. It implies that what we consider separate beginnings may be chapters of a single story interrupted. It suggests that our ancestors were not isolated pioneers, but inheritors of a broader human experiment. Loss on this scale does not require annihilation. It requires forgetting. When a network collapses, local nodes can persist while the network itself disappears. The memory of connection fades first. What remains is parochial history mistaken for origin. This forgetting is reinforced by time. As generations pass, inherited practices are naturalized. They no longer feel borrowed, they feel inevitable. The question of where they came from stops being asked. Evidence of connection becomes harder to see because it no longer has context. A shared symbol might be dismissed as archetypal, a similar technique as convergent evolution. These explanations are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They account for similarity without addressing scale. A global culture need not have been uniform or centralized to leave behind a coherent legacy. It need only have facilitated exchange long enough for ideas to circulate and settle. After catastrophe, the circulation stops, but the ideas remain, stranded in place. The silence surrounding this possibility is not enforced. It is maintained by comfort. A fragmented past is easier to manage than a continuous one. Separate origins allow for tidy timelines. A shared origin complicates ownership, progress, and identity. Yet, the traces persist, in calendars that align, in myths that echo, in techniques that repeat, in questions that refuse to stay local. The vanishing of a global culture would leave behind a world full of half-remembered answers. Each civilization holding a piece of a larger pattern it no longer recognizes, each convinced of its own beginning, unaware that it is standing in the middle. The flood in this view is not just water, it is disconnection. It is the severing of roots, the narrowing of vision, the shrinking of the world. What follows feels like rebirth only because memory has been thinned. If such a culture existed, its disappearance would be almost total, not because it failed, but because it was undone by forces indifferent to meaning. Rising seas do not discriminate. They erase coastlines, not ideas. They scatter people, not knowledge. What we inherit afterward is uneven. Some regions remember more, others remember differently, none remember completely. This uneven inheritance creates the illusion of independent invention. Similar solutions arise to similar problems, but with familiar contours. The resemblance is not coincidence, it is residue. The question that remains is not whether a global culture vanished, but whether we have learned to recognize the signs of vanishing, whether we can distinguish absence from erasure, whether the gaps we see are empty or simply beyond the edges of what survived. And if the world once felt smaller because it was more connected, then perhaps the greatest loss was not technology or architecture, but perspective, the sense that humanity was already, once, a shared endeavour. Catastrophe is often imagined as an interruption, an accident that derails an otherwise stable path. Yet when examined across deep time, catastrophe begins to look less like an anomaly and more like a mechanism. Not a single event, but a recurring pressure that reshapes life, culture, and memory with indifferent precision. The Earth does not guarantee continuity, it permits it temporarily. Geological records reveal rhythms of disruption that exceed human planning. Ice ages advance and retreat. Volcanic winters dim the sky. Oceans surge inland, then withdraw. None of these processes require intent, yet their consequences are decisive. Civilizations that adapt endure. Those that do not are erased not through judgment, but physics. What unsettles is the timing. Periods of rapid environmental change appear to cluster around moments when human complexity either collapses or reorganizes. These transitions are often treated as beginnings, but they may be better understood as resets, points where accumulated systems are stripped back to essentials. The flood fits this pattern with uncomfortable elegance. A sudden rise in sea level does not destroy humanity evenly. It targets coasts first, then river valleys, then lowlands, the very places where population density, trade and knowledge exchange are most concentrated. Inland groups survive more easily, but often with less access to accumulated infrastructure and information. This selective erasure creates an illusion of primitivism. Survivors appear less advanced not because they were incapable, but because the centres of advancement were lost first. A reset does not wipe the slate clean, it leaves fragments, tools without manuals, practices without explanations, stories without context. Over generations, these fragments are repurposed, ritualized, or misunderstood. What was once functional becomes symbolic. What was once precise becomes sacred. The idea of civilization reset challenges the belief in linear progress. It suggests that advancement is conditional, reversible, and vulnerable. That intelligence alone does not protect complexity. That memory is as fragile as material. Modern society often treats catastrophe as an external threat, something to be avoided, mitigated, or controlled. Ancient narratives treat it as inevitable, not always frequent but unavoidable, a force that returns when balance is lost or simply when conditions align. These narratives do not frame catastrophe as punishment alone, they frame it as correction, compression, or renewal. A clearing of excess, a return to fundamentals. The language is moral, but the mechanism is ecological. If the pre-flood world achieved a level of sophistication that depended on stable climate and predictable seasons, then it was inherently vulnerable to rapid change. Its collapse would not require war or internal decay. It would require only acceleration, change faster than adaptation. In this light, catastrophe becomes a filter. It selects for mobility, flexibility, and memory rather than accumulation. Portable knowledge survives. Heavy infrastructure does not. The reset favours those who can compress culture into minds rather than monuments. This perspective reframes survival myths. The chosen are not morally superior. They are adaptable. They are light enough to move, resilient enough to remember, and fortunate enough to be positioned away from the first wave of loss. After the reset, rebuilding begins under constraint. Fewer people, less land, shorter horizons. Knowledge is applied cautiously. Complexity returns slowly, if at all. The world feels harsher, less forgiving. Memory of abundance fades. Over time, this scarcity becomes normalized. Later generations assume that the post-reset world is the only world that ever existed. Stories of a richer past sound exaggerated, mythical, impossible. Memory is dismissed because experience no longer supports it. The idea of repeated resets is deeply unsettling because it implies that collapse is not a failure of character, but a property of systems. That no amount of sophistication guarantees permanence. That intelligence can be reset by forces that do not notice it. Geology supports this discomfort. The planet has undergone mass extinctions that reshaped life entirely. Dominant species vanished. Ecological hierarchies inverted. Recovery took millions of years. There is no reason to believe that human civilization is exempt from this pattern. What differs is memory. Humans remember collapse. They encode it. They warn their descendants through story and symbol. The flood becomes a teaching device, not because it was unique, but because it was formative. If catastrophe resets civilization, then history is not a straight line but a waveform. Peaks of complexity rise, then fall. Knowledge accumulates, then fragments. Each cycle begins not from zero, but from residue. This residue shapes the next rise. It biases development. It accelerates certain skills while obscuring their origins. The next civilization believes it is inventing, but it is often rediscovering. It walks paths already worn smooth by predecessors it no longer remembers. This does not diminish human achievement. It situates it within a larger rhythm. The discomfort comes from proximity. If resets have happened before, they can happen again. The same mechanisms that erased coastal cultures 12,000 years ago still operate. Ice melts, seas rise, climate shifts faster than institutions adapt. The flood, in this sense, is not ancient history, it is a template. What matters is not whether the pre-flood world was more advanced, but but whether it was more fragile than it realized. Advancement increases dependency. Complexity creates vulnerability. Systems optimized for stability struggle under acceleration. After a reset, survivors often misinterpret what was lost. They mourn tools, cities, and abundance, but overlook the deeper loss, shared perspective, the sense of continuity across generations, the belief that tomorrow will resemble today. When that belief collapses, caution replaces ambition, memory replaces innovation, survival replaces expansion. The world that emerges afterward feels simpler not because humans have regressed, but because the environment demands restraint. Complexity becomes a risk rather than a reward. If the flood was one such reset, then its legacy is not merely myth or ruin. It is a lesson encoded in fear and reverence, a reminder that civilization is provisional, that memory must be guarded. That knowledge must travel lightly, and if resets are part of Earth's long rhythm, then the most advanced civilizations may not be those that build the highest, but those that remember the longest. The question left unresolved is not whether catastrophe will come again, but whether this time enough memory will survive to recognize it not as an ending, but as a return. After catastrophe, history does not resume evenly. It moves through people, through those who remember differently, who carry fragments that do not fit the new world. Survivors are rarely neutral vessels. They're shaped by what they endured and by what they choose to protect. In many traditions, the figures who emerge after the flood are described as teachers. They arrive not as rulers, but as guides. They introduce agriculture, law, measurement, and ritual to populations portrayed as scattered or disoriented. These figures are often remembered ambiguously, half human, half divine, not because they were supernatural, but because their knowledge felt disproportionate to their circumstances. The label of divinity is a convenient way to explain asymmetry. If a small group survived a global disruption with access to preserved knowledge, their capabilities would appear extraordinary to those rebuilding from scarcity. Skills would look like miracles. Understanding would resemble authority. Over time, reverence would replace explanation. These teachers rarely claim authorship. They restore rather than invent. They re-establish patterns that feel familiar but cannot be traced. Their role is transitional, bridging a world that no longer exists with one that is struggling to form. What follows is often ambivalence, gratitude mixed with suspicion, respect tempered by fear. Knowledge that empowers can also destabilize. Teaching too much, too quickly, risks repeating the imbalance that preceded collapse. This tension appears in myths where instructors eventually withdraw, disappear, or are rejected. The knowledge they bring survives, but the source fades. Memory simplifies. Complexity is pared down to rules. The living relationship between teacher and student is replaced by tradition. Over generations, the figure of the survivor teacher becomes symbolic. Their human qualities blur. They become culture heroes, ancestors, gods. The original context, the catastrophe, the preservation, the deliberate restraint slips out of focus. There is also the question of prohibition. Not all knowledge is passed on, some is withheld, some is encoded indirectly. In many traditions, certain teachings are restricted, reserved for initiates, or warned against entirely. The language surrounding them is cautionary rather than celebratory. This caution may not be moral, it may be practical. If the pre-flood world collapsed under the weight of its own complexity, then survivors would have reason to limit what they transmit. Knowledge without context can be dangerous. Systems optimized for a stable world can fail catastrophically under new conditions. Teaching becomes an act of triage. This selective transmission leaves behind gaps. Later generations inherit powerful techniques without understanding their constraints. They replicate effects without grasping causes. Over time, misuse becomes inevitable, reinforcing the belief that such knowledge is forbidden rather than incomplete. The idea of forbidden teachers unsettles because it suggests intentional shaping of history, not through conspiracy but through caution. Survivors decide what is safe to remember, what must be forgotten, what should be disguised as myth to prevent misuse. This shaping does not require centralized control, it requires consensus among those who remember the cost of collapse. Silence becomes a form of protection, forgetting becomes a survival strategy. As civilizations grow distant from catastrophe, this strategy loses clarity. The reasons for restraint fade. What remains are rules without rationale, taboos without explanation, myths that warn without context. Later institutions inherit these fragments and formalize them. Knowledge becomes doctrine. Doctrine becomes authority. Authority becomes gatekeeping. What began as protection transforms into control. At this stage, the line between preservation and suppression blurs. Teaching is regulated. Inquiry is constrained. The memory of loss is replaced by fear of disruption. History is curated to emphasize stability over truth. This process does not require malice. It requires comfort. Established systems prefer continuity. Questions that threaten foundational narratives are discouraged, not because they are false, but because they are destabilizing. Survivor teachers, once revered, become inconvenient. Their stories are reinterpreted, moralized, or dismissed as allegory. The practical implications of their knowledge are softened. What they knew becomes less important than what they symbolize, yet traces remain, in sudden leaps of capability, in techniques that reappear without lineage, in warnings embedded in myth that seem oddly specific. The presence of survivors complicates the idea of total reset. Civilization does not restart from zero. It restarts from memory filtered through trauma. What emerges is shaped as much by what is avoided as by what is pursued. If the world before the flood was more advanced, then its survivors carried not only knowledge but regret, awareness of fragility, understanding of thresholds that should not be crossed lightly. This awareness may explain why early post-flood societies often appear conservative. They prioritize tradition over experimentation, ritual over innovation, stability over expansion. These choices are often interpreted as ignorance, but they may reflect restraint. As time passes, restraint loosens, memory dulls. New generations push boundaries without remembering why they were set. Complexity returns, ambition grows, the cycle resumes. The survivors fade entirely, leaving behind systems no longer anchored to their original intent. The warnings encoded in myth become stories for children. The lessons lose urgency. What remains is a question buried beneath reverence and omission. How much of what we call forbidden knowledge was once ordinary understanding, withheld not to dominate, but to protect? And if some teachers chose silence over instruction, not because they lacked answers, but because they remembered the cost of giving them too freely, then the gaps in our history may not be accidents, they may be choices. The unsettling possibility is not that knowledge was hidden from us, but that it was hidden for us. That forgetting was not failure, but strategy. That memory was shaped to prevent repetition. If so, then every time a civilization rediscovers fragments of this deeper past, it stands at a familiar threshold, deciding once again whether to remember everything, or whether some lessons are only learned when they are lost. History is not only written by those who survive, but by those who organize survival into story. Between memory and record sits a narrow gate, and not everything is allowed to pass through it unchanged. What emerges on the other side is not false, but curated, shaped by priorities that often remain unspoken. Every civilization inherits more than events. It inherits frameworks for interpreting them. These frameworks determine what counts as evidence, what qualifies as knowledge, and what is dismissed as noise. Over time, the framework becomes invisible, mistaken for neutrality. Decisions made long ago harden into assumptions. After catastrophe, these assumptions become especially powerful. Rebuilding requires coherence. Fragmented memories must be aligned, contradictions are inconvenient, narratives that complicate recovery are softened or set aside. What is preserved is what stabilizes. This is not deception, it is triage. Early institutions, religious, scholarly, administrative, emerge to hold memory steady. They catalogue, codify, and transmit. In doing so, they select. Some stories are elevated as foundational, others are relegated to allegory. Still others are quietly ignored, not because they are false, but because they do not fit. Over generations, this selection process shapes identity. A civilization learns who it is by learning what it remembers. The past becomes a tool for the present, not a mirror of itself. Continuity is emphasized. Rupture is minimized. If the world before the flood was more advanced, acknowledging it would introduce rupture. It would complicate the story of ascent. It would suggest that progress can be undone, that authority can be inherited rather than earned, that the present is not the pinnacle it imagines itself to be. Such implications are destabilizing. Institutions tasked with preserving order naturally resist them, not through conspiracy, but through preference. Stability favors narratives that affirm continuity and inevitability. Questions that threaten this comfort are framed as speculative, fringe, or unnecessary. This framing shapes scholarship. Research paths are rewarded or discouraged. Funding follows consensus. Debate narrows. Over time, the boundaries of legitimate inquiry shrink around what feels safe to ask. The effect is subtle. No one needs to suppress evidence actively. It is enough to interpret it conservatively. Anomalies are explained locally. Patterns are broken into parts. The larger picture is never assembled. Language reinforces this process. Terms like myth, legend, and symbolic create distance. They imply unreliability without requiring refutation. Once applied, they are difficult to remove. A story labelled myth is rarely revisited as data. This is not always unjustified. Many myths are not literal accounts, but literalism is not the only measure of value. Myths can encode observation, warning, and memory in forms that survive disruption better than records. When myths are dismissed wholesale, the information they carry is lost along with their imagery. The authority to decide what counts as history is rarely questioned by those who inherit it. It feels natural, necessary. Yet authority itself has a history. It emerges from specific conditions, often from the need to consolidate after chaos. Post-catastrophe societies are especially sensitive to instability. They privilege order. They build systems to prevent recurrence. In doing so, they may unknowingly seal off avenues of memory that point backward too clearly. As centuries pass, the reasons for these decisions fade. What remains are traditions that feel ancient and unquestionable. The original caution becomes dogma. Inquiry becomes transgression. This dynamic does not require a single controlling institution. It emerges wherever continuity is valued over complexity, wherever coherence is preferred to ambiguity, wherever identity depends on a particular story of origin. The question of who decides what counts as history is therefore not accusatory. It is structural. It asks how systems behave when faced with information that destabilizes their foundation. If evidence of a pre-flood advanced world were to surface unmistakably, it would not simply add a chapter to history. It would demand a reconfiguration of meaning. It would challenge educational narratives, philosophical assumptions, and cultural hierarchies. Such reconfiguration is expensive. It threatens legitimacy. It invites uncertainty. The safer path is reinterpretation. To absorb anomalies into existing frameworks without altering their shape, to treat them as exceptions rather than signals, to maintain the outline of the story even as details strain it. This process can persist indefinitely. History becomes resilient not because it is complete, but because it is adaptable. It bends without breaking. Yet bending has consequences. Over time, the gap between what is known and what is acknowledged widens. Scholars sense it. Curious minds feel it. A quiet tension develops between the official narrative and the questions that refuse to disappear. These questions circulate at the edges, in interdisciplinary spaces, in comparative studies, in marginal research that connects dots others avoid. They are not always correct, but they are persistent. What they share is a discomfort with closure. If the world before the flood left behind traces that do not fit, then the challenge is not to force them into alignment, but to reconsider the frame itself, to ask whether the criteria for historical legitimacy are too narrow for the scale of time involved. Deep time does not respect our categories. It dissolves neat boundaries between prehistory and history, myth and record, observation and story. It demands humility from those who try to map it. The authority to decide what counts as history is not fixed. It shifts as evidence accumulates and perspectives widen. What was once unthinkable becomes discussable. What was dismissed becomes reconsidered. This process is slow by design. It protects against error, but it also protects against insight. The unsettling possibility is not that history has been deliberately falsified, but that it has been carefully simplified. That complexity has been trimmed away to preserve coherence, that the past has been edited to feel safe. If so, then the silence surrounding a pre-flood advanced world is not proof of absence. It is the echo of a decision made long ago, to prioritize stability over depth, continuity over rupture. The question that remains is not who controls history, but whether history itself has become too narrow to contain what it once held. And if remembering more would destabilize the present, then the most profound loss may not be knowledge itself, but the courage to ask how much has been left out. There is a subtle anxiety that surfaces whenever the past begins to feel too large. Not fear of being wrong, but fear of what remembering might require. To acknowledge that civilization has risen and fallen before is to accept that permanence is an illusion and that the present is less secure than it appears. This anxiety shapes what is remembered and how. It encourages distance. The deeper past is treated as abstract, impersonal, safely mythic. It is easier to contemplate extinction when it belongs to another species, another era, another story. It is harder when it begins to resemble a rehearsal. Remembering too much destabilizes identity. It complicates progress. It suggests that advancement is not destiny, but condition. That intelligence alone does not guarantee survival. That the future is not an arrow, but a loop. Civilizations prefer beginnings. They prefer moments of origin that affirm uniqueness. To remember a prior advanced world is to concede that one's own achievements may be repetitions rather than breakthroughs. This concession feels diminishing even if it is not. What is often avoided is not the idea of collapse, but the idea of inheritance. If others reach similar heights and lost them, then what we possess is not unprecedented. It is provisional, and what we risk losing has already been lost before. This recognition breeds humility, but also unease. In many traditions there is a warning embedded beneath the flood, not a warning about water, but about forgetting. About mistaking stability for permanence, about confusing accumulation with resilience. These warnings are often framed morally, but their core is practical. They suggest that knowledge must be carried carefully, that complexity requires stewardship, that systems grow fragile when they outpace understanding. Remembering a pre-flood advanced world would require confronting these warnings directly. It would demand reflection not only on what was lost, but why, on what choices preceded collapse, on whether similar patterns are unfolding again. Such reflection is uncomfortable. It threatens confidence. It undermines narratives of inevitable progress. It invites comparison where distinction is preferred. There is also the burden of responsibility. If collapse is cyclical, then prevention becomes uncertain. Effort does not guarantee outcome. Preparation does not ensure survival. This ambiguity is difficult to live with. It is easier to believe that catastrophe belongs to the past, sealed off by time. The fear of remembering too much is therefore also a fear of relevance. If ancient collapses mirror modern vulnerabilities, then history stops being distant. It becomes intimate. It begins to speak directly to the present. Institutions built to stabilize society tend to resist this intimacy. They emphasize difference over similarity, progress over pattern. They frame past collapses as primitive failures rather than systemic consequences. This framing is comforting. It suggests that modern complexity is different, smarter, safer, that lessons have been learned, that repetition is unlikely. Yet complexity increases dependency. Systems become interlinked. Failures cascade. Stability becomes brittle. These are not signs of invincibility. They are signs of efficiency optimized under specific conditions. If those conditions change rapidly, as they have before, efficiency becomes vulnerability. Remembering too much would mean admitting this. It would mean recognizing that the present sits on thresholds already crossed in the past, that warning signs may not announce themselves dramatically, but accumulate quietly. There is also the question of grief. To remember a lost advanced world is to mourn it, to accept that beauty, insight and effort can vanish without redemption, that not all stories end in triumph. This grief has no clear outlet. It does not inspire conquest or innovation. It inspires caution. Caution is rarely celebrated. As a result, remembrance becomes selective. Fragments are allowed. Full pictures are avoided. The flood is remembered as myth, not as precedent. Collapse is remembered as anomaly, not as cycle. Those who attempt to connect these fragments often feel resistance, not always external, but internal. A sense that they are trespassing on something unsettling. That certain questions carry emotional weight disproportionate to their academic framing. This weight signals proximity. The closer a question comes to the present, the heavier it feels. The fear is not that the past will be revealed as greater, but that the present will be revealed as temporary. That the structures we rely on are not endpoints, but phases. That memory itself is a survival trait we may be neglecting. If the world before the flood was more advanced in certain ways, its loss is not an indictment of intelligence, but of assumption. It assumed continuity. It assumed time would behave as it always had. It assumed that what worked yesterday would work tomorrow. These assumptions are easy to inherit. They feel natural. They persist until they fail. Remembering too much would force a re-evaluation of what advancement means. It would shift focus from expansion to resilience, from novelty to continuity, from growth to balance. Such a shift challenges economic, cultural and philosophical foundations. It invites restraint where ambition is rewarded. It values longevity over acceleration. This is not a message easily integrated, and so the memory remains partial, enough to intrigue, not enough to transform. The flood becomes a story told at a distance. The advanced world before it becomes speculation. The warning is softened. Yet the unease does not disappear. It lingers beneath curiosity. It surfaces in moments of recognition, when ancient patterns align too closely with modern ones, when echoes feel too precise to ignore. The fear of remembering too much is therefore also the fear of listening too closely. If history is cyclical, then memory is not passive. It is active defense. It is the ability to recognize familiar dangers before they fully materialize. Forgetting dulls this defense. It leaves each cycle to relearn its limits through loss. The choice is not between certainty and doubt, but between awareness and comfort. If the world before the flood holds lessons that extend beyond myth, then remembering them would require courage, not to rewrite history, but to let it speak without insisting on reassurance. and if the past is trying to remind us of something we once knew and then forgot, the question is not whether we are capable of remembering, but whether we are willing to live with what that remembrance implies. Patterns do not announce themselves as truths. They emerge quietly, repeating until recognition becomes unavoidable. Civilization, when viewed across sufficient depth, begins to resemble less a ladder and more a tide, advancing, retreating, reshaping the shore each time it returns. The difficulty lies in scale. When history is compressed into centuries, progress appears linear. Innovations accumulate, institutions solidify, memory feels secure. But when the lens widens to millennia, continuity fractures. What once seemed permanent reveals itself as provisional. Peaks appear where valleys were forgotten. Across distant regions and eras, similar arcs repeat. Periods of stability give rise to specialization. Specialization deepens interdependence. Interdependence amplifies efficiency. Efficiency narrows margins for error. Then a disruption, environmental, climatic, or systemic, arrives faster than adaptation. Collapse follows, not as sudden annihilation, but as cascading simplification. What remains afterward is not ruin, but residue. This residue biases the next rise. It preserves certain techniques, values, and warnings while discarding others. The new civilization grows within constraints it does not fully understand, guided by inherited habits rather than explicit memory. It believes itself original because it cannot see what shaped it. This blindness is not failure, it is structural. Memory degrades unevenly. Some knowledge is easier to carry than context. Tools survive better than explanations. Practices endure long after their purpose fades. The pattern beneath civilization is therefore not repetition of detail, but repetition of structure. Rise through accumulation. Stability through balance. Vulnerability through complexity. Collapse through acceleration. Renewal through memory. If the world before the flood was more advanced in certain respects, it likely followed this same arc. Its advancement would not have been identical to ours. It would reflect different priorities, constraints, and opportunities. But its pattern would feel familiar. The flood becomes not a unique event, but a phase transition, a point where accumulated systems exceed the tolerance of their environment. Water is not the cause. It is the medium through which imbalance resolves. This perspective reframes advancement itself. Progress is not an endpoint. It is a phase, one that carries within it the seeds of its own transformation. Each gain introduces dependency. Each optimization reduces redundancy. Each reduction increases fragility. The civilizations that endure longest may not be those that advance fastest, but those that maintain slack, room for error, room for memory, room for adaptation. These qualities rarely leave impressive ruins. They leave subtle traces. When we look backwards searching for greatness, we often search for scale, monuments, cities, empires. But scale is not resilience. It is exposure. The larger the structure, the more surface it presents to disruption. A pre-flood advanced world might therefore leave behind fewer obvious signs of its sophistication. Its knowledge may have been embedded in rhythms, alignments, and practices rather than mass. Its technology may have favoured integration with environment over domination of it. Such a civilization would be difficult to recognise after collapse. Its remnants would feel understated. Its absence would be easy to misinterpret as primitiveness. The pattern beneath civilization suggests that forgetting is not accidental, it is functional. Each cycle forgets enough of the last to allow renewal without paralysis. Complete memory would inhibit adaptation. Partial memory enables continuity. This selective forgetting creates tension. Too much memory leads to stagnation. Too little leads to repetition of error. Civilization oscillates between these extremes, never settling permanently. If we inherit fragments of a pre-flood world, they shape us subtly, in our myths, in our measurements, in our orientation toward the sky and the land. These fragments do not tell us what to build, they tell us how to notice. The flood, then, is not simply destruction. It is pruning. It removes what cannot adapt to new conditions. It leaves behind seeds rather than structures. Those seeds grow into forms suited to a changed world. This does not absolve loss, it contextualizes it. Beauty, insight, and effort vanish without guarantee of return. But the pattern suggests that loss is not meaningless. It feeds the next configuration. The unsettling implication is not that civilization will fall again, but that it is always falling somewhere. That collapse is not an event, but a process unfolding unevenly across space and time. While some regions rise, others simplify. While some knowledge accumulates, other knowledge disappears. This unevenness creates the illusion of progress. We focus on peaks and ignore valleys. We chart ascent without mapping descent. We treat collapse as anomaly rather than counterpart. The pattern beneath civilization asks us to hold both simultaneously, to see growth and fragility as inseparable, to recognize that advancement carries responsibility not just to innovate, but to remember. If the world before the flood followed this pattern, then its disappearance is not a mystery to be solved, but a lesson to be integrated. It does not ask us to recreate its achievements. It asks us to understand its trajectory. Understanding does not require certainty. It requires attention, the willingness to notice repetition without insisting on identity, to accept that the past may rhyme rather than repeat. As the pattern becomes visible, the question shifts. It is no longer about whether there was an advanced world before the flood. It becomes about whether advancement itself is a recurring phase, not a destination. If so, then the measure of civilization is not how high it climbs, but how gently it lands. Not how much it accumulates, but how much it can carry through disruption. The pattern beneath civilization is quiet. It does not promise salvation or doom. It offers perspective. It reminds us that time is larger than narrative and that history is less a story than a rhythm. The rhythm continues whether it is acknowledged or not. Each cycle hums with the residue of those before it. Each rise is shaped by forgotten falls. Each present is haunted by the futures it has already lived through in other forms. And as this pattern presses closer to recognition, the remaining question is not whether we stand at a peak or a valley, but whether we can hear the rhythm clearly enough to recognize where we are within it. There is a question that lingers beneath all others, not because it lacks answers, but because it resists being asked directly. It waits at the edge of every discussion about origins, progress, and loss, quiet enough to be ignored, persistent enough to return. What if the most important lesson of the world before the flood is not what it built, but what it misunderstood about itself? Civilizations often search the past for proof of greatness. They want to know whether others reached higher, built larger, knew more. But this curiosity can obscure a subtler inquiry, not how advanced they were, but how they related to their advancement, whether they recognized its limits, whether they understood the cost of speed, scale, and certainty. If the pre-flood world achieved a form of sophistication that exceeded what survives in the record, then its disappearance carries meaning beyond tragedy. It becomes a reflection on assumption, on the belief that stability is permanent, that systems will adapt simply because they have always done so, that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan without humility. These beliefs are not foolish. They are human. The flood, in every version of the story, interrupts confidence. It arrives not at the height of ignorance, but after long familiarity with the world. It arrives when routines feel reliable, when patterns feel predictable, when knowledge feels sufficient. This timing matters. It suggests that collapse does not punish failure alone. It also disrupts success. Systems optimized for a particular world struggle when the world changes too quickly. Mastery becomes rigidity. Efficiency becomes fragility. If the world before the flood was more advanced in certain respects, its loss does not imply inferiority. It implies overconfidence in continuity, a misreading of time as stable rather than conditional. What survives catastrophe is rarely what was most impressive. It is what was most adaptable, what could move, what could be remembered without infrastructure, what could be taught without authority. Memory becomes the final technology. This reframes the artifacts we search for. Instead of asking where the machines are, we might ask where the habits are. Instead of looking for engines, we might look for rhythms. Instead of demanding proof of power, we might attend to patterns of restraint. The world before the flood may have understood its environment deeply, yet still misjudged the pace of change. Knowledge does not guarantee foresight. Awareness does not ensure caution. Intelligence does not prevent momentum. These are uncomfortable realizations because they collapse distance. They suggest that what happened before could happen again, not because history repeats mechanically, but because humans do. The question we avoid then is not about ancient capability. It is about modern vulnerability, about whether we are asking the same questions too late, whether we are mistaking sophistication for resilience, whether we are assuming that complexity will protect us rather than expose us. Remembering a pre-flood advanced world is unsettling because it denies exceptionalism. It places us within a lineage of civilizations that rose, stabilized, and then confronted limits they did not fully anticipate. It suggests that intelligence alone is not the solution to instability, that wisdom lies elsewhere. Where that wisdom resides is unclear. It may be found in redundancy rather than optimization, in diversity rather than uniformity, in memory rather than novelty. These are not glamorous values. They do not build monuments quickly. They do not announce themselves loudly. They endure quietly. If the survivors of the flood carried knowledge forward selectively, perhaps they were not hiding secrets. Perhaps they were modeling restraint, teaching what was necessary, withholding what required conditions no longer present. Over time, this restraint may have been misunderstood as prohibition, silence interpreted as secrecy, caution reframed as control. The original intent to prevent repetition of collapse lost beneath layers of ritual and authority. What remains for us is ambiguity, fragments of memory without instruction, warnings without context, patterns without explanation. This ambiguity invites speculation, but it also invites humility. It reminds us that not everything lost needs to be recovered. Some knowledge may have belonged to a world that no longer exists, under conditions we cannot recreate safely. The challenge is discerning which lessons are timeless and which were context-bound, which fragments point toward resilience, and which toward repetition. The question we're avoiding is therefore ethical as much as historical. Not, were they more advanced, but did they know when to stop? Not what did they build, but what did they choose not to pass on? These questions do not resolve neatly. They do not lend themselves to confirmation or denial. They linger because they mirror our own uncertainty about direction. As the present accelerates, the past feels closer. Patterns align. Old stories feel newly relevant. The flood ceases to be distant myth and becomes metaphor for threshold, an image of change arriving faster than preparation. The world before the flood does not demand belief. It demands attention. It asks whether we can listen to memory without insisting on mastery, whether we can learn from loss without needing to recreate it. Perhaps the most advanced civilizations are not those that leave the largest ruins, but those that leave the clearest warnings. Not instructions carved in stone, but questions embedded in story. Questions like this one, still unanswered, still circling quietly. If a world before us learned too late that progress without foresight is fragile, what does it mean that we are asking the same questions now, with the same confidence that this time will be different? The answer is not written in ruins or myths or maps. It is unfolding slowly in the choices we make while believing we are standing at the end of history rather than somewhere in its middle. And if the flood is not behind us but around us, taking forms that do not resemble water, then the true measure of advancement may not be how much we remember about the past, but whether we can recognize ourselves in it before forgetting becomes necessary once again.